The desert dust had not yet settled after the last wheels of the stagecoach vanished over the horizon. Asha Monroe stood still beneath the noonday sun of Copper Creek, Arizona territory, a small town carved into red earth and dry wind, as if it existed solely to test the will of those who stayed. In her hands was a letter sealed with red wax, freshly opened. The paper was thin, the handwriting soft and familiar. Aunt Esther, from Boston, her only living relative. The slanted lines spoke of the house on Beacon Hill, of a teaching position waiting for her, of a proper life. One without the sting of sun-scorched leather, without the curious stares of frontier folk. At the end her aunt had written, "You do not belong to that land of dust and wind, Asha. Come home to where you will be seen as a lady, not as a shadow lost in the desert." Asha read that part again and again until the words blurred in her eyes. Sweat salted her lips, mixed with the dust that clung to her skin. Somewhere across the street, a door creaked shut. Caleb Ward stood beneath the awning of the general store, his cowboy hat shading half his sunburned face. He watched her, not the way a man looks at a woman, but the way someone looks at loss, afraid to name what still aches. A gust of wind lifted the hem of Asha's cotton dress. She felt his gaze without needing to raise her head. She folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, as though afraid the whole town might hear the rustle of paper. Across the street, Caleb turned away, stepping down from the porch, though his gray eyes flickered back once, holding something unspoken. In his own pocket was another letter, one he had written and rewritten for weeks, but never found the courage to send. Asha crossed the street and reached for the door handle. "Mr. Ward," she said softly, lowering her gaze. "Miss Monroe," he replied, his voice low and hesitant. That was all. Yet the silence that followed felt long enough to pull the whole town into its breath. When the door closed behind her, Asha leaned against the worn wooden counter. The room was still, save for the faint hiss of wind sneaking through the cracks. She pressed a hand over her chest, where the letter rested. 5 years in Copper Creek had taught her how to live alone, how to smile at customers buying sugar, how to stay quiet when laughter turned sharp. But she had never stopped longing for a place where she might belong. Not a city, but a feeling. Outside, Caleb's boots thudded softly against the dry ground. He paused by the window, watching her shadow through the dusty glass. The light traced her face as she bent toward the counter, her profile caught in a stripe of sun. There was something in that stillness that gripped him. Strength mixed with weariness. Pride tangled with solitude. He laid a hand briefly on the window frame, then walked away. By evening, Asha finished her ledger. Between the lists of goods and debts lay a blank space she couldn't name. As she blew out the lamp, she glimpsed Caleb's figure down the dirt road, his shape drawn long against the fading sky. He lingered for a moment before heading toward his ranch, his silhouette swallowed by the red dust of dusk. Each carried a letter that night, one calling her to leave, the other waiting to be sent. Asha did not sleep. The wind whispered through the cracks like a faraway voice. She opened her letter again, read it one last time, and laid it gently on the table. In the flicker of the oil lamp, she looked out the window. The Ward Ranch was only a small, dark shape in the wide plain beyond, and she wondered if life could be rewritten from a moment like this, when the red dust settles, and two people, unspoken, each carry words that might yet change everything. The next morning, sunlight poured into Copper Creek earlier than usual. The first beams slid across the weathered sign of Monroe's Goods, glinting through the dust-frosted window panes. Inside, Asha was rearranging sacks of flour and lantern oil when the steady rhythm of hooves echoed on the porch. She didn't need to look up to know who it was. Caleb Ward. He always came around this time, at the start of the month, when the ranch needed supplies. But today, his footsteps sounded different, slower, more hesitant. The door creaked open, the small bell above it jingled softly, and for a moment, the still air inside seemed to hold its breath. "Good morning, Miss Monroe." His voice was low, warm, edged with a careful restraint. Asha turned around. Light fell across her curls, forming a faint halo. "Good morning, Mr. Ward. What can I get you today?" Caleb removed his hat, revealing a sun-browned forehead and those pale gray-blue eyes that made people lose their composure. He drew a folded paper from his pocket, dampened slightly with the sweat of his hand. "Supply list for this month. We've taken on 4 new hands, so we'll need a bit more than usual." She took the list, her fingers brushing his. A brief touch, but enough to still her for half a second. His hand was rough and warm, carrying the scent of leather and dust, of long days beneath the open sky. She pulled back quickly, tucking her hand into the folds of her skirt. "Give me a moment. I'll get everything ready." Caleb nodded and set his hat on the counter. He stood quietly, watching her move. She walked between the shelves, lifting sacks of sugar, coils of rope, and bottles of oil, each motion steady and precise, the rhythm of someone long accustomed to solitude, to doing, folding, placing, never missing a beat. "I heard they're building a new rail line heading east," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Might be folks leaving Copper Creek soon. Maybe even you." Asha looked up, her dark eyes meeting his through the slats of the shelf. "I haven't thought about that." "Haven't thought," he said softly. "Or haven't decided." She pressed her lips together and turned back to the supplies. "My business isn't up for discussion, Mr. Ward." He was quiet for a moment, then said, almost gently, "I didn't mean gossip. I just would hate to see this store empty." Her hands stilled. A thin silence stretched between them. Outside, the wind rattled the wooden sign. Caleb stepped closer, lifting a coil of rope from the upper shelf. "You might need someone taller for this," he said, his tone halfway between humor and truth. She accepted it, her fingers brushing his again. This time, she didn't pull away right away. She looked down, her hand small and dark against his sun-browned skin. 2 colors that shouldn't blend, and yet in that moment, they seemed to. She released the rope slowly and stepped back. "Thank you." Caleb gave a faint smile but said nothing more. He lowered his gaze to the list, pretending to double-check it, as if to hide the shift beneath his calm. Watching him, Asha suddenly understood what made him different from the other men in town. Not just his height or his quiet strength, but the restraint he carried. The sense that if he ever let it go, everything around him might come undone, and neither of them would know how to stop it. When Asha wrapped the last of his goods, she asked, "Would you like me to have these delivered? Or will someone from the ranch come for them?" "I'll send a hand tomorrow," he said, putting his hat back on. "If it's no trouble, I might come by myself to settle the bill." "It's no trouble," she replied softly. He walked toward the door, but paused before stepping out. With his back to the light, he said quietly, "You seem preoccupied with your letters lately. I just wanted to say, not every letter brings good news." She froze, unable to answer, before the door closed behind him. The bell chimed once, then silence again. Asha stood still, listening to the receding sound of hooves, until all that remained was the whisper of wind through the porch boards. Slowly, she walked to the window and looked out at the dusty road. Caleb's figure was fading into the brightness, swallowed by the heat and distance. She pressed her hand against her pocket, where the letter from Boston still rested. The paper was cool, but her heartbeat burned hot beneath it. A feeling without a name rose inside her, something that frightened her almost as much as she didn't want it to end. Somewhere out in the desert, two hearts had begun to shift, not through words, but through silences deep enough to remind them both that they were no longer alone. The next morning, Copper Creek was quieter than usual. The early light poured through the windows of Monroe's goods, soft and golden, as if the whole town were holding its breath, waiting for something to unfold. Asha was restocking shelves when she heard the steady rhythm of hoofbeats outside. Heavy, certain footsteps crossed the wooden floorboards, followed by a voice she knew too well, low, calm, and unmistakably his. "Morning, Miss Monroe." She looked up, startled by how her heart reacted before her mind did. "Good morning, Mr. Ward. You're early today." Caleb removed his gloves, setting his hat on the counter. "I came to settle my account from last week, and to give you something." Her brows lifted. "Something?" From his coat pocket, he drew out a small envelope sealed with brown wax. On it, in firm, unpolished handwriting, were the words, "For Miss Asha Monroe, to be read in private." Asha froze for a moment before taking it. Their fingers brushed, a fleeting touch, but enough to send a tremor through her chest. "Should I read it now?" she asked softly. He shook his head. "No. When you're alone. I'm better with words on paper than out loud." He tipped his hat and left. The door closed behind him, the bell chiming faintly, leaving her in a warm haze of sunlight, the letter in her hand light as paper yet heavy as her heartbeat. All day, she didn't open it. She tucked it into the drawer of her desk, but every time she passed by, her eyes found it again, as if that sealed piece of parchment held the power to change everything. By late afternoon, the light slanted through the old curtains, painting the room in muted gold. Asha tried to focus on sorting the ledger, but her thoughts kept circling back to him, the way he had taken off his hat, the quiet steadiness in his eyes, the weight of the moment when he'd handed her that letter. Caleb Ward was a man who kept his distance, yet within that distance there was something gentle enough to make her afraid. When evening fell, she dimmed the shop lights, leaving only the glow of a single oil lamp. Outside, the prairie wind carried the scent of smoke and damp earth through the small back room. Asha sat at her desk, opened the drawer, and drew out the letter. She didn't mean to read it, only to hold it, perhaps. But her fingers betrayed her. She broke the seal, unfolded the page, and began to read. The words were simple, the handwriting deliberate. He wrote about the last 5 years, how he had watched her rebuild her father's store alone, how she'd stood tall under the weight of gossip, how she'd brought warmth and order to a place once known only for dust and drought. And then came the confession. Not bold, not poetic, just honest. He wrote of quiet admiration, of how seeing her work and endure had changed the way he saw the world. And finally, a single line that seemed to still the air around her. "If you choose to stay, stay with me." Asha stopped reading. Her pulse thudded in her ears, not from the confession itself, but from the way it felt to be seen, truly seen. She could not remember the last time anyone had spoken of her without measuring her by color, class, or history. She folded the letter and leaned back in her chair. Against her chest, tucked inside her blouse, was another letter, the one from Boston, her invitation to safety. 2 letters, 2 roads. One promised comfort, the other risk. Outside, the wind swept red dust against the window pane. Far off, she could see a faint light still burning at the Ward Ranch, a single lamp flickering against the dark. She knew he was awake, perhaps waiting, though not expecting anything more than hope itself. Asha set Caleb's letter beside the one from Boston. 2 pieces of paper. 2 futures. She stared at them for a long time, her eyes reflecting the flame of the oil lamp. "Maybe it's not about where I belong," she whispered to the quiet room, "but who I belong with." The words dissolved into the night, carried away by the wind across the prairie, the beginning of the choice that would change her life forever. That afternoon, sunlight poured over Copper Creek in ribbons of gold, glinting off dusty streets and the window panes of old shops. Asha left her store before sundown, restless at heart. She had read Caleb's letter 3 times since the night before, and each reading made it harder to breathe. It wasn't just a confession. It was an invitation, a challenge, a mirror that made her see herself through someone else's eyes. And that scared her. Because out here, everything had a price: labor, reputation, and sometimes even love. She spotted him before he noticed her. Caleb was standing near the water trough, talking to someone, then turning away. Asha walked straight toward him, her skirt brushing the dust. Her voice broke out before reason could stop it. "Mr. Ward, I need to speak with you." He turned, startled by the firmness in her tone. "About my letter?" "Yes." She stopped a few steps from him, clutching the small bag at her side. "I just need to know, did you mean what you wrote? Or do you simply think keeping me here benefits Copper Creek? The store, your trade, this town?" Caleb was silent for a moment, long enough for the wind between them to spin a small swirl of gold dust at their feet. Then he took a step closer, his gaze steady. "I'm a man of this land, Asha," he said, his voice deep and sure. "I don't say things I don't intend to keep. I didn't write that letter to gain anything. I wrote it because I wanted you to know that someone sees you, truly sees you." Asha stood still. The simplicity of those words hit harder than any grand declaration. "Do you realize how dangerous that is?" she asked quietly. "You're a respected man here, and I are a woman they respect," Caleb cut in. "You rebuilt that store from debt, made this town think twice about how they treat women, especially a woman like you. You're stronger than this place, Asha, and that's not flattery." She looked at him for a long time, caught between wanting to believe and fearing she already did. "Aren't you afraid? Of gossip? Of laughter? Of being called a fool?" Caleb narrowed his eyes against the fading light. "I'm more afraid of losing my chance to say what I needed to say. Afraid you'll leave before I can." A breeze drifted through, stirring the hem of her dress. Around them, the sounds of town faded. The clang of the blacksmith, the chatter of children, the neigh of horses, until only their breathing filled the space between. Asha didn't know who looked away first. She only knew that for a fleeting moment, every wall she had built around herself had cracked. There was something in his gaze, steady, unyielding, that made her feel both safe and dangerously seen. You make it sound so simple, she said, trying to steady her voice. But what if I leave tomorrow? Caleb's smile came slow and soft, the kind that carried both hope and resignation. Then I'll respect your choice. But I'll remember that once in my life, I said what I truly meant. She looked down, at her dusty shoes, at his worn boots. The distance between them was barely a step. Yet neither moved. The breeze carried the faint scent of hay from the ranch, brushing loose strands of hair across her forehead. Caleb lifted a hand, almost to tuck it behind her ear, then stopped halfway. That small restraint, that moment of almost, filled her with gratitude and an ache she couldn't name. There are some things, he said quietly, that break too easily if spoken. So I'll wait, until you're ready. Asha lifted her head, meeting his gaze without turning away. The last light of day fell across their faces, washing everything in pale gold. They stood there in silence, and in that silence, everything that needed saying had already been said. When Caleb turned and walked away, Asha watched until his shadow disappeared around the bend. Inside her, something fragile but enduring had taken root, a small, steady faith that needed no promises, only truth. And that night, for the first time in years, she did not open the letter from Boston. The rain began after midnight. First a few scattered taps on the tin roof, then a relentless downpour that didn't let up. By morning, Copper Creek was drowning in muddy water. The narrow stream that wound around town had swollen into a roaring beast, breaking over its banks and swallowing fences, barrels, and the lower parts of the road. The air smelled of wet earth and grass, thick and heavy. Asha stood at the window of her store, watching the main street disappear beneath the brown current. The water lapped against the wooden steps, each wave striking the door harder than the last. From outside came shouts, the frightened cries of children, the frantic neighing of horses. The door burst open. Caleb stepped in, soaked to the bone, his breath ragged. Asha, we're building sandbag walls by the river. If the water rises any higher, half the town's gone. My store. Forget the store. Things can be replaced. People can't. His voice was firm, but his eyes lingered on her longer than they should have. In that instant, her fear eased, replaced by something steadier, something that made her believe him. She nodded. All right, I'm coming. She rolled up her sleeves, hiked her skirt, and followed him out into the rain. The downpour stung her face like cold stones. Caleb caught her arm, steadying her as they waded through thick mud toward the riverbank, where the townsmen were forming a line, passing heavy sacks from hand to hand. He didn't stop her. He simply met her gaze once, then tossed her an empty sack. You fill, I'll haul. She obeyed, her hands trembling from the cold, but steady with purpose. At first, a few men stared, the black woman in her drenched dress, covered in mud. But when she kept working without pause, shovel after shovel, they stopped watching. They just passed her more bags. Caleb returned, mud streaked across his shirt, hair plastered to his forehead. He reached for the sack she held, their hands slipping in the slick grime. Careful, he said, his breath close enough for her to feel its warmth against the rain. I'm fine, she answered, her voice barely audible above the wind. You don't have to do this. Yes, I do, she said softly. This is my town, too. They kept at it until the afternoon, their short calls and heavy breaths blending with the storm's rhythm. Then the earth began to crack, the current thrashing harder. Asha's foot slid. She fell into the mud with a gasp, the icy water up to her knees. Caleb lunged forward, seizing her arm and pulling her up. Her dress clung to her skin, his grip firm on her wrist. "Don't," he said, voice rough. "Don't let go of me." She looked up at him. The rain fell in sheets, tracing down their faces until no one could tell what was rain and what was tears. He didn't release her hand until the river calmed, until the cheer rose behind them. The makeshift dam had held. When the flood finally passed, the town fell into an exhausted silence. The sky cracked open, revealing a faint stripe of pale gold on the horizon. People drifted home. Only a few stayed behind to clean up the wreckage. Caleb and Asha sat on the store's front steps, drenched and caked with drying mud. She leaned her head against a post, breath shallow. Caleb sat beside her, quiet. After a moment, he removed his gloves and reached for her wrist, where a red mark had formed from the rough sandbags. "Does it hurt?" he asked. She looked down at his hand, strong, tanned, calloused from years of labor, and for the first time she didn't pull away. The touch was gentle, almost reverent. "No," she whispered, "only a little sore." Caleb didn't reply, but the corner of his mouth lifted, just slightly. They sat in silence, listening to the drip of rainwater from the roof and the slow retreat of the stream. The fading light turned the wet ground to gold. In that quiet, Asha felt something shift, not in the land, but inside her. Among all the noise and rushing water, something had taken root. When Caleb finally rose to leave, he paused, his voice low and rough. "I'll come back tomorrow. Get some rest." She nodded, watching as he walked away down the glistening road, his reflection stretched across the puddles. The warmth of his hand still lingered on her wrist. As the last drops fell against the window, Asha sat alone in the dim light, listening to the storm's fading sigh. Outside, the floodwaters receded, but within her, another current had begun to flow, quiet, unstoppable, and alive. The rain hadn't fully left Copper Creek. That night, a thin mist veiled the sky, carrying the scent of damp earth and fresh grass around the little house. Asha sat by the window, the oil lamp casting a faint golden glow across her face. The shop was quiet, but her heart wasn't. Since the flood, Caleb's image had stayed with her, his eyes, his hand gripping hers in the current, the touch at her wrist that still burned like a quiet ember beneath her skin. A soft knock came. She froze. Outside, the wind rattled the porch. Then a familiar voice called through the drizzle, low, calm, certain. "Asha, I brought some dry wood. The door still open?" She rose and opened it. Caleb stood there, his coat dark with rain, arms full of firewood and a folded blanket. Droplets slid from his hair, and the lamplight caught the lines of his sun-worn face, his gray-blue eyes steady and kind. "You shouldn't be alone tonight," he said. "The ground's still soft. The creek's high. I just wanted to be sure you're safe." She meant to say she was fine, that solitude was no stranger to her. But the words faded when she saw him, a tall figure in the rain, both strong and uncertain, his concern worn openly like a badge of honor. She only nodded. "Come in. You're soaked." Caleb set the firewood by the hearth, hung his coat to dry, and smiled when her small cat brushed against his boots. They didn't speak. Only the fire crackled, and the wind whispered across the porch. Asha sat in her chair. He took the one across from her. Between them, the lamplight wavered. a bridge of gold and shadow. She poured him tea, their fingers brushing as she passed the cup. The touch was small, but it stopped them both. Caleb set the cup down, his gaze steady on her. "Asha," he said softly, "that day, when I thought I'd lost you in the flood, I was scared, more than I've ever been." She looked into the fire. "I was scared too, not of dying, but of leaving this world without ever having been truly loved." He gave a sad, gentle smile. "Now you know." She lifted her eyes to his. The look between them said what words never could. No promises, no declarations, just two souls finally seeing what had always been there. Asha reached across the narrow space, her hand finding his arm. A pale scar ran along the muscle there, rough and faded. "Where did this come from?" she asked. "A horse threw me," he said, "when I was a boy. First time my father made me hold the reins. I let go." She smiled faintly. "You don't let go anymore." "No," he murmured, his voice deep, his eyes locked on hers. "Not when it's something I want to keep." The space between them vanished. Caleb reached out, tracing a line along her cheek with trembling fingers. The gesture was simple, reverent, so tender it made her breath catch. Asha didn't pull away. She tilted her head slightly, letting his hand fall to her neck, then her shoulder. The lamplight danced across her dark skin, soft and alive, and for a moment he seemed afraid to breathe, as if any sound might break what they'd found. There were no pleas, no haste, just the quiet rhythm of shared breath, the warmth of skin meeting skin, the sound of two hearts that had carried too much silence finding their way back to one another. When his lips met hers, it wasn't hunger, it was recognition. The knowing that the world could judge them, but for this night, it belonged to no one but them. They lay together by the fire's glow, the storm fading into the distance. Every wound, every lonely year seemed to soften under the hush of their closeness. Asha rested her hand on his chest, feeling his heartbeat, slow, steady, and in rhythm with her own. Later, they stayed there without words, her head on his shoulder, his hand wrapped around hers. Outside, the last drops of rain fell gently, the night breathing in peace. Caleb whispered, "Maybe this is what people mean when they say two souls find each other." Asha smiled, her fingers tightening in his. "No, Caleb, this is what they mean by coming home." The fire dimmed to embers, casting a faint golden glow over their resting forms. Two figures bound in quiet, whole and unafraid, as if the world itself had just remembered what warmth felt like. On that autumn morning, Copper Creek woke earlier than usual. The news traveled fast, through the wooden houses, the saloon, the blacksmith's yard, all the way to the stagecoach stop. Caleb Ward, owner of the largest ranch in the territory, had officially proposed to Asha Monroe. At first, no one believed it. Then came the whispers, half wonder, half suspicion. A wealthy white rancher could have chosen anyone, yet he'd chosen the black storekeeper at the end of town. By noon, the story had spread everywhere. Eyes began to change, some curious, some disapproving, a few pitying, and a rare few that seemed quietly moved, as if witnessing something fragile and impossible. Asha had known the town would hear eventually. Still, when it happened, her hands trembled. Every time someone entered the shop, she imagined the murmurs behind her back. How did she manage that? or he's just pitying her. But Caleb didn't care. That afternoon, he came to the store as always, shirt white, sleeves rolled, the scent of hay and sunlight following him. In his hand, a small wooden box. "So, what are they saying now?" she asked, her voice light, teasing on the surface but edged with unease. "Plenty," he said, setting the box down. "None of it matters." Asha opened it. Inside lay a simple silver ring, its surface engraved with a wildflower. No gemstones, no frills, just something unmistakably Caleb, sturdy, unpretentious, and true. "You made this?" she asked. He nodded. "I asked the smith to mix in some silver from my mother's bracelet. She used to say, real love only needs enough. Not more, not less." Asha smiled faintly, though her eyes glistened. "You realize this will make the whole town look at you differently?" Caleb stepped closer, until his breath warmed her cheek. "Let them look. I only need you to look at me like that." That evening, the news reached the largest saloon in Copper Creek. A circle of men nursed their beers, the air thick with mockery. "Ward," one of them said, smirking, "you sure about this? A man like you could marry any rancher's daughter north of here. Why her?" Caleb stood. The room fell silent. The lamplight cast hard shadows across his face, but his eyes were calm, cold steel over quiet conviction. He set his glass down and spoke evenly. "She doesn't have to be anyone else. She's who I chose, and if that bothers any of you, you're free not to work for me." A few chairs scraped the floor. Others stared into their drinks. That was the end of it. No more jokes, no more questions. Caleb's words, plain and firm, closed the matter like a door. The next morning, when Caleb entered the store, Asha was sitting by the window. She had already heard what he'd said at the saloon. When he came near, she didn't speak. She only looked at him. Her eyes held no hesitation now, only trust, gratitude, and something deeper than love. He took her hand and slid the silver ring onto her finger. There were no flowers, no preacher, no witnesses, only two hands meeting in a shaft of noon sunlight falling through the window. "You're not alone anymore," he whispered. Asha smiled, her voice trembling just a little. "I never thought I'd hear that from you." "And I," he said softly, "never thought I'd have anyone to say it to." That afternoon, a letter arrived from Boston. Aunt Esther's familiar script filled the page. "I've heard the news, my dear Asha. If it's true, congratulations. I pray for your happiness. But if ever you wish to come home, this house still has a room for you." Asha folded the letter gently, smiling faintly. She didn't know that the next letter from Boston, the one still on its way, would carry the greatest test of her life. For now, she simply sat in the glow of late afternoon, the silver ring glinting softly on her hand, her heart as light as the wind. Outside, Caleb was leading his horse from the barn. He turned back once, their eyes meeting through the open doorway. No words were needed. Every vow worth speaking had already been said, in silence. The wedding date was set. In less than 2 weeks, Copper Creek would witness something it had never seen before: the marriage of a black woman and the most prominent white rancher in the territory. The town buzzed with curiosity and disbelief, a mix of gossip and awe. But Asha only smiled. Her days were filled with small, tender preparations: hemming the dress, choosing wildflowers, tasting cakes, things she had never dared to imagine she'd have. That evening, as the last light faded, the postman arrived with a letter sealed in red wax. Asha knew the crest instantly. Boston, the city she had left behind. All lace curtains, afternoon teas, and the faint echo of piano music from parlors that had never truly felt like home. She broke the seal and read slowly. Aunt Esther's handwriting was as neat and refined as ever, but the words beneath it made Asha's pulse quicken. A relative in Boston had passed away, leaving her a substantial inheritance, a house, land, and a sum of money large enough to change everything. Her aunt had written, "You must appear in person within 2 weeks to claim it. This chance comes only once in a lifetime." Asha set the letter down, her chest tightening. She looked around the small shop, the rough wooden shelves, the lingering smell of roasted coffee beans, the soft amber light falling on the familiar goods she'd built her life around. Suddenly, everything felt distant. In Boston, she could have comfort, respect, a name that carried weight. She would never again be the subject of side glances or whispered judgments. But would anyone there speak her name the way Caleb did? Low and warm, like a promise? When Caleb arrived that evening, she handed him the letter. He read it silently, his expression darkening with every line. When he finally looked up, his voice was steady, though it trembled at the edges. "If you want to go," he said, "I won't stop you. I don't want our marriage to begin with a sacrifice." Asha studied his face. The lamplight revealed the fatigue of long days and the quiet ache of a man trying to do what was right, even if it meant losing her. "You think I'd leave?" she asked softly. "I think you should think carefully," he replied. "That inheritance isn't just money. It's a way to live safely, without dust, without struggle." She stepped closer, placing her hand over his chest, feeling the steady thrum of his heart. "I've lived safely for half my life, Caleb. In Boston, I wore fine dresses, spoke in perfect tones, and was treated like something behind glass. I left because I wanted to live, and here I did. Here I found you." Caleb said nothing. His eyes, gray as storm clouds, revealed a war between reason and longing, between wanting her free and wanting her to stay. Asha picked up the letter again, folded it carefully, and slipped it into the fireplace. The flames caught quickly, licking at the paper's edges, curling it into glowing ash. The firelight flickered against their faces. "The letter said I must return to claim my inheritance," she whispered. "But I don't need to return anymore. I've already found what I want." Caleb's hand rose, brushing her cheek, pausing where a tear had traced a line through her skin. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "If I go, I'll be wealthy and alone again. If I stay, I'll be poorer, but I'll have a home and someone who sees me." He took her hand, holding it tightly, as if anchoring them both in that moment. Neither spoke. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, tapping against the roof in quiet rhythm, as if blessing the choice she'd made. Later, when Caleb left, Asha stood by the window, watching his silhouette fade into the darkness. She knew her life had turned down a different road, not the smooth, carpeted path of Boston, but the rough red one that wound through this land of dust and wind, where each step forward meant choosing to stay. Tomorrow, they would go on planning the wedding. But that night, with the fire still burning low and warm behind her, Asha knew her heart was settled, not on Boston, not on wealth, but on love, and the small wooden porch where, for the first time, she had been seen exactly as she was. That morning, Copper Creek felt reborn. The prairie wind swept through town, carrying the scent of wet earth and new grass after the rain. The sky opened wide and impossibly blue, as if even heaven wished to witness something the town had never seen before. A wedding between two souls who had once stood on opposite sides of the world. Asha rose early. Mabel, the older woman who'd long treated her like a daughter, stood behind her, weaving her hair into soft braids and tucking wildflowers between them. The dress, cream-colored, hand-sewn over countless quiet nights, hung perfectly now, simple yet graceful, its sleeves puffed lightly, the hem grazing the wooden floor. Asha looked into the mirror and saw not a woman trying to prove her worth, but one finally at peace with her choice. Outside, townsfolk gathered around the small wooden chapel on the hill. No one spoke much, only the sound of the wind slipping through the tin roof, the distant clop of hooves, and the smell of baked bread from somewhere nearby filled the air. Some faces still carried curiosity, others hesitation, but there was no scorn anymore. The quiet steadiness in Asha and Caleb's eyes had silenced most of that long before the ceremony began. Caleb stood at the end of the aisle. His brown vest wasn't new, but it was clean and pressed. The sun caught in his hair, giving it the glint of copper fire. When Asha appeared at the chapel door, he forgot to breathe. For a heartbeat, the world fell away. She walked slowly, a small bouquet of wildflowers bound with a white ribbon in her hands. The fabric of her dress brushed against the wooden floor, whispering like wind through tall grass. Every gaze followed her, but she saw only one. The quiet warmth in Caleb's, brighter than any promise. When she reached him, he extended his hand. She placed hers in his. Their skin was different, yet the moment they touched, that difference disappeared. The murmurs faded, replaced by a stillness so complete it seemed sacred. The preacher began the vows. His voice was old and trembling, but steady like an ember in the hearth. When it came time to speak, Caleb turned fully toward Asha, his hand still holding hers. "I don't have much to promise," he said, voice low and rough. "Only this. I'll stand beside you, no matter how the land shifts, no matter who turns away, because you are the truest thing I've ever known." Asha met his gaze, tears shining at the corners of her eyes. "I once thought love was a luxury, something meant for others," she whispered. "But you taught me that sometimes all it takes is one person who sees you without judgment, and you're born again." No one spoke. Only the wind filled the pause, circling them like a blessing. Then the preacher's voice came, slow but sure. "I now pronounce you husband and wife, before God and before all who stand here." Caleb bent down, and their kiss was as soft as a prayer, yet deep enough to bridge centuries of silence. It wasn't just their first kiss in public. It was the breaking of an invisible wall that had always divided what was possible from what was not. Applause broke out, hesitant at first, then rolling into laughter and cheers. Children clapped, women wiped their eyes, and Mabel whispered under her breath, "Thank the Lord. She's found peace." Outside the chapel, people brought out pies, cider, and an old fiddle. Asha and Caleb stepped into the sunlight, hand in hand. The wind lifted her skirt. The silver ring on her finger caught the light, gleaming like a promise that would not fade. They began their first dance on the uneven ground before the chapel. The crowd quieted again, not out of propriety, but awe. In that moment, no one saw color, class, or history. Only two people, swaying to a melody older than the land itself, looking at each other as if the world had just begun. When dusk fell, the last light poured over Copper Creek like honeyed silk. Caleb leaned close, his voice barely above the wind. "We did it, Asha." She smiled, eyes shining. "No, Caleb. Love did." And as the music and laughter carried across the prairie, Copper Creek witnessed something the Wild West had almost forgotten. A love unafraid of difference and a vow strong enough to outlive the night. The road to Ward Ranch shimmered beneath the sun, the soft red dirt yielding under the hooves of the horses. Asha sat in the back of the wagon, still holding the bouquet of wildflowers from the wedding, now wilted, yet fragrant, simple and enduring, like the love she had just stepped into. Caleb held the reins beside her, the wind brushing his hair, carrying with it the scent of hay and the open plains. Neither spoke. From time to time, they glanced at each other, quiet smiles passing between them, saying what words could not. "We're going home." The house appeared beyond the line of willows, broad and solid, yet cold. The roof was faded, the timber walls raw, the windows veiled with dust. It was the house of a man who worked, not one who loved. But when Asha stepped through the door and laid her hand against the frame, she smiled. "It's only waiting," she said softly, "for someone to make it alive again." Caleb nodded, his silence carrying more meaning than any vow. Those first days smelled of pine, fresh paint, and the whistle of wind slipping through the cracks. Asha began filling each corner with warmth, a vase of field flowers on the table, an embroidered cloth she'd made draped over the armchair, soft curtains that gentled the light. Caleb, used to the stillness of the ranch, started learning to listen, to the hum of her humming as she cooked, the rhythm of her steps down the hallway, her laughter spilling like sunlight across the afternoon. At night, they sat by the fireplace and read to each other. Asha's stories came from Boston. The theater, winters with falling snow, streets paved in stone, while Caleb's told of open plains, cattle drives, and storms beneath endless stars. Two worlds that once felt miles apart began to meet in the glow between them. In words, in glances, in the long silences neither wished to break. One morning, Asha returned from the market with dried lavender, hanging the bundles along the doorway. The fragrance drifted through the house, mingling with the smell of coffee Caleb brewed. He stood on the porch, watching her water the flowers in the yard, sunlight dusting her dress, her hair tied loosely at her neck. No one had ever taught him how to love like that, not through desire or possession, but through stillness, through the quiet awe of realizing something precious had chosen to stay. Asha wrote a letter to Aunt Esther in Boston. She described their new life, a home where the wind still crept through the shutters but never felt cold, a man who rose before dawn to light the fire, and a night sky so full of stars she needed no lamp to read by. "Aunt," she wrote, "I did not become wealthy, but I live among things money can't buy, peace and a heart that stays." Caleb wasn't a man of letters, but when Asha read the note aloud, he smiled faintly and said, "Tell her I keep my promise, to make sure you never regret staying." That evening, they sat, together on the porch. The sun dipped behind the distant ridges, casting the ranch in shades of gold. The horses were returning to the stables, their calls echoing across the valley. Asha rested her head on Caleb's shoulder. His arm came around her, rough and warm, smelling faintly of earth and smoke. "Do you think the house feels different now?" she asked. He smiled. "It's not empty anymore." No, she said softly. It's breathing. From the window, a warm light spilled across the field, mingling with the thin veil of mist rising from the grass. The house that had once known only silence now held laughter, footsteps, and the gentle creak of floorboards beneath two sets of feet. Every small thing bore their mark. The cup she'd dropped that he'd carefully mended, the towel he'd burned learning to cook his first meal. Summer moved slow. The house that had once been cold grew as warm as the hearth itself, and in its every breath lived the story they were writing together. One of quiet days, honest work, and the grace of simply belonging. They didn't need grand words or distant promises. Only evenings like this, when the sun sank low, the breeze stirred softly through the grass, and they both knew they had found what mattered most in this wide, untamed land, a home and each other. That summer came early, pouring honeyed sunlight over the hills of Copper Creek. Asha began to feel a quiet change within herself. The soft fatigue in the mornings, the quickened breath, the way her hand often drifted unconsciously to her stomach, as if confirming a secret. When the town doctor smiled and said she was expecting, Asha sat still for a long while, unsure whether to laugh or cry. She found Caleb outside, mending the fence by the pasture. His shirt hung over his shoulder, his tanned skin glistening with sweat. She called softly. He looked up, and at the sight of her expression, his face gentled immediately. "What is it, Asha?" She took his hand and placed it over her stomach. "We're going to have a child." Caleb froze. The wind seemed to stop. Only the faint chirring of crickets filled the space between them. He looked at her, then down at his hand resting over the small curve of life forming beneath her ribs. His broad shoulders trembled. He pulled her close, burying his face against her neck. When Asha heard the quiet break in his breath, she realized the man who had stood unshaken through storms was crying. From that day, everything on the ranch changed. Caleb became careful in ways that both amused and touched her. He wouldn't let her lift anything heavy, woke early to brew her ginger tea, and whenever she frowned from exhaustion, he dropped everything to sit beside her until she smiled again. "You act as if I'm fragile," she teased. "You're not fragile," he said simply. "I've just never had anything so precious to keep." The house they'd built filled with laughter and preparation. Caleb spent evenings crafting a cradle from pine, smoothing the edges with his calloused hands and painting it pale. Asha stitched blankets, embroidering sprigs of lavender along the hems, the same flowers she had once planted around their porch. Mabel stopped by often, bringing warm bread and the knowing advice of a woman who had raised 6 children. "Let him handle the heavy work, dear," she'd say with a wink. "Your only task is to smile." Caleb would chuckle every time. At sunset, they sat on the porch and spoke of the baby, whether it would have his blue-gray eyes or her warm brown skin. Caleb would rest his ear on her belly, pretending to listen. "I can't hear a thing," he'd laugh. "That's because it's listening to you," she'd answer, running her fingers through his hair. "It wants to know who this man is, the one who'll teach it to see the world with kindness." The months passed. Asha moved slower but never lost her light. Caleb worked harder, yet each time he turned, she was there on the porch, knitting little sweaters, her gaze following him across the golden fields. Sometimes she wrote letters to Aunt Esther, telling her this summer felt unlike any other, not because of the sun, but because she was carrying a piece of 2 worlds inside her. Then the day came. Mid-June, the air heavy and cloudless. Asha went into labor while Caleb was at the stables. He ran home, his heart pounding like thunder. The whole town rallied. Mabel took charge as midwife. Mrs. Crane brought hot water. And outside, Caleb sat on the porch steps, his hands clenched white, head bowed. Then it came. The first cry, clear and strong, slicing through the still air like the song of the wind over the prairie. Mabel stepped out, her wrinkled face glowing. "Both mother and child are well," she said. Caleb entered the room. Asha lay on the bed, hair damp, her face pale but radiant. In her arms was a tiny bundle of life, skin the color of sun-warmed honey, eyes flickering open with a glint of both her warmth and his calm. Caleb knelt by the bed, his hand trembling as it brushed the baby's cheek. Asha smiled weakly. "Our daughter, Caleb. I want to name her Grace." "Grace Monroe Ward," he repeated, his voice breaking on the words. "It's perfect." He kissed the child's forehead, then Asha's, whispering, "I didn't know a heart could hold this much joy." Outside, the summer wind swept across the valley, carrying the scent of lavender and the cry of meadowlarks. Inside that small room, Asha watched the two of them, father and daughter, two shades of the same soul, and knew they had done something extraordinary. In this harsh land, they had created what no prejudice or storm could destroy, a family born of courage and tenderness. And in the baby's soft laughter, Asha heard her life's answer, that every wound, given time and love, can bloom into something whole and beautiful. Night settled slowly over the prairie. Moonlight stretched across the fields like a ribbon of silver, glinting off the roof of a house that now carried the warmth of two lives within it. Asha sat on the porch, her daughter asleep in her arms, the baby's soft breaths blending with the whisper of wind threading through the willow trees. From inside, the faint crackle of the fire mixed with the lingering scent of lavender drifting through the yard. Caleb sat a few steps below her, a worn guitar resting on his knee. His fingers moved gently across the strings, coaxing out a slow tune that melted into the night. The hum of crickets, the shuffle of horses in the barn, the steady rhythm of life itself. They often joked that this was the song of Copper Creek. Asha watched him, her chest filled with a quiet peace she couldn't name. In the moonlight, his face looked carved from the earth, strong, steady, yet it softened each time he looked up at her. She thought of the letters that had once changed everything, the one from Boston, promising her a life of comfort and distance, and the one from Caleb, his handwriting rough but sincere, inviting her to stay, if she still believed in love. Her voice broke the silence, soft as the wind. "If I'd left Copper Creek back then," she said, "I don't think I'd ever have known what love really was." Caleb looked up, a faint smile tugging at his lips, tired, but warm, like a man who'd finally found home after a long journey. "And if I hadn't written that letter," he replied, his voice low and hoarse, "I'd still be a lonely man with a ranch too big, a house too empty, and a heart no one had ever knocked on." Asha smiled. She laid her daughter gently into the cradle beside her, then stepped down to sit beside him. They looked out over the fields, the moonlight spilling over the grass like water. "Do you remember the flood?" she asked, leaning her head on his shoulder. "I still think if it hadn't come, we might never have truly seen each other." Caleb chuckled. "And I think if it weren't for the storms, we'd never have learned how to hold on." A breeze lifted a strand of her hair, brushing against his cheek. He reached out, tucking it gently behind her ear, a small gesture, one so familiar it no longer needed words. She looked at him, his eyes reflecting the moonlight, steady and deep as the earth after rain. I used to think letters only brought sorrow, she whispered. Bad news, farewells, rejection. But I've learned some are written just to bring two people closer. And to change their lives forever, Caleb added, his hand finding hers. Like ours did. She nodded, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. The prairie stretched out endlessly before them, and in the middle of that vastness, their little house glowed like an ember. The baby slept, the wind hummed, and they sat side by side, saying nothing more. Asha's fingers brushed the silver ring on her hand, the one Caleb had forged from his mother's bracelet. The moonlight caught on its edge, flashing briefly like a heartbeat. Do you ever wonder, she murmured, what might have happened if we'd never gotten those letters? Caleb squeezed her hand. No, he said softly, because if it was meant to be, it would have found its way to us. Maybe not by letter, maybe by wind, or by a glance across the market square. She laughed quietly. The sound drifted out into the open fields, blending with the rustle of grass and the fading chords of his guitar. There were no vows, no witnesses, just two hands clasped together, two souls who had already spoken all that needed to be said. In the cradle, their daughter stirred, her tiny fingers curling into the night air. Asha looked from the child to Caleb, her eyes filled with quiet gratitude. For life, for every hardship that had shaped them, for the letters that had once divided them, but now bound them for life. When Caleb finally set the guitar aside, they sat together in silence, listening to the wind sweeping across the plains. Above them, the stars burned bright and endless, and there, in the heart of a land once known for its dust and distance, two people held hands, knowing that every letter, every storm, every tear had led them to this, a home and a love that no longer needed words. If the story of Asha and Caleb brought a smile to your heart, we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts on love that endures. Hit like to support these stories, and subscribe to join us again for more Wild West love stories, where every love leaves its echo, like sunlight that never fades from the western sky.